propose Fra McCann assume the chair.
If I can just briefly run through the process, members will be aware of it. In the absence of the chair and deputy chair, the committee can elect a chair so that we can take forward the business on a formal footing. I'll simply call on members to nominate a member. That will have to be seconded. If there are no then I will then call for further nominations. If there are no further nominations, then the person who's nominated will be asked if they're willing to accept the chairmanship, and in which case they will then take a seat. So if I could just ask members for a nomination, and remember it does need to be seconded.
I propose Fra McCann.
And could there be a seconder of that?
I'll second that.
Can I call for any further nominations? If no further nominations, can I ask Mr. McCann to take the seat, please?
Thank you, Cam. Thank you, members. Just to continue, I noted that the 2015-16 objectives included improving staff awareness of motor neurons disease, dementia and stroke. Why are these diseases and disorders particularly relevant to the programme, and how does the SSA identify and prioritise such training needs?
What I actually did in doing this was I asked our outreach officers what they come across whenever they go into people's homes and what they find difficult. And these were the stroke one in particular for dysphasia, people who maybe have speech problems. They identified that themselves from the outreach officers. The dementia one, again, was from outreach officers, because a lot of times they're in people's homes and as a result of dementia somebody's going into a care home. So it was really getting a wee bit more awareness about that. And the motor neuron disease actually came from one of our community-based partners, where we were asked to go out and do a presentation to them, and they talked about it, and as a result of that I put it into the Year 3 plan. So that's how the 3 came about. So what we're going to do is train our telephony staff who are on the end of that make a call number, and also our outreach officers. So if they come in contact with somebody who has one of these diseases, they actually know how best to treat them and to communicate with them.
And would you always have to have a family member present, or somebody identified from the family when the interview takes place?
You mean just in general, an interview? Not necessarily. If somebody is defined as vulnerable, we can go out and visit their house. If they request somebody there, that's not a problem. The times somebody is, if somebody has dementia, sometimes they have an appointee, which is somebody who looks after their affairs and their benefits for them. So that person would be there if that was the case.
And sometimes whenever an outreach officer would be in someone's home and realise that they may need someone else there to attend, they may highlight that and come back another time and make some other arrangement, just to ensure that they have as full and comprehensive an assessment as they can have.
Thank you very much for that. What do you anticipate as being the key challenges the increasing benefit uptake plan will have in relation to the introductions of welfare changes, and how are you preparing for them?
I think the introduction of welfare changes has left the publicity around it has left a lot of people out there confused. And that is one of our challenges, is particularly the elderly, is making sure the elderly know the likes of universal credit, the likes of the introduction of PIP isn't going to affect them. So that's a big challenge for us, because it won't affect them. If you're on DLA and you're over 65 and PIP does come in, you're going to stay on DLA. So it's trying to get and reassure them that that is the case. And maybe one of the challenges, should welfare reform come in as well, or not a challenge, but in the introduction of PIP in the customer journey, we've actually built in a touch point for our outreach officers to intervene. For example, I don't know if we're about the PIP customer journey, but it's a telephony based at the start, and then they get a paper based form. And like we said earlier, it can be quite daunting to get a paper based form, but if somebody doesn't return that paper based form, there will be a trigger, and I'll be asked to send one of the outreach officers out to that person's home to make sure that they understand and they can complete that form. So they are some of the challenges, but I think it's the confusion and the communication and the reassurance, I think, at the minute for me, is what for the elderly.
I think added to that, for our staff, we need to ensure that they are fully informed and have knowledge of the changes in order to, do their job appropriately and to advise customers of the changes and the impact.
Yeah, right. Thanks very much for your presentation. Does any of our members have any questions? Okay, again, thanks very much for your presentation. But to formally open the committee this morning, I would ask that if any members have any interest in the clerk, could they do that now? If not, then we could move on with apologies. I have apologies from Alex Mosky, Stuart Dixon, Gregory Campbell and Sammy Wilson. Draft minutes. Any comments on the draft minutes? And are members are content with the minutes of the 11th of June as drafted?
Yes, agreed.
Chairperson's business, there doesn't seem to be any matters arising. You will I was going to read that. Matters arising from the minutes. What's that?
It's the conference call.
Yeah. The Minister for Social Development has provided an in-confidence copy of the Houses of Multiple Occupation bill. The Minister has noted that he expects this bill to go before the Executive soon. The last scheduled meeting is before the recess on the 2nd of July. Should members wish to have a copy, could they please notify officials and this can be provided?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Executive considered the pension scheme bill and the Minister's proposal to seek accelerated passage for the bill at its meeting on Thursday, the 11th of June 2015. The Executive approved that the bill be introduced to the Assembly. The provisional order paper has scheduled the motion for accelerated passage on the second stage for June 30th.
Okay, noted.
The Department has also been in contact with committee officials regarding the briefing on affordable warmth scheduled for the meeting on the 2nd of July. The Department indicated that the programme has only been operating with the participation of all the councils since April of this year. It noted that as a result, it is too early to properly appraise the programme. Therefore, while officials are willing to brief the committee on July 2nd, they have asked if the committee would consider a briefing in early September instead to allow fuller appraisal of the programme. This may provide the committee with a more balanced view of and greater insight into how the programme is progressing. Are people feeling that right?
I would like an early briefing. I'm picking up concern very few completions have occurred to date, so I think at least an early briefing to find out what's causing the delay would be useful rather than waiting another 2 months.
Well, I think there was a number of members that have raised the same thing, have raised their concern. I know that Dolores had raised it and Paula and some others. So, but
The briefing is still scheduled for the 2nd of July.
2nd of July. So we'll go ahead with the 2nd of July
Yeah,
briefing.
yeah, that'd be good, thanks.
There was to be an informal meeting with Speak Up today and its young advisors, but it has had to be rescheduled due to insufficient member availability. And I know the chair intends to meet the project at their premises before the summer recess, so we'll reschedule it.
So what's been rescheduled?
It's a speak up event, you remember?
Oh, right, yes, we were announced, we were advised of it, yeah.
We'll now move on to the briefing on the Direct Labour Organisation strategy, cost and update. So if people could come to the table, Jerry Flynn and Clark Bailey from the Housing Executive. You're very welcome to the meeting this morning. At the meeting on the 21st of May, the committee considered correspondence from Unite and an answer to an Assembly question in relation to the increasing cost and scale of the Housing Executive's Direct Labour Organisation. The committee agreed to seek an update from the department as soon as possible. The clerk in Framakon also met informally with Unite on Monday, 15th of June, to discuss their concerns, and Unite has written to the committee following this informal meeting. The correspondence has been provided for reference, starting at page 30 in the meeting packs. Members, just refer members to the cover note and briefing paper, starting at page 3 of table items. The committee, I'd like to advise the committee that the following officials are here to give information to the committee on the Direct Labour Organisation in relation to strategy and cost. And I've already said Clark Bailey and Jerry Flynn. So the floor is your own.
Okay, thanks very much, Chairman. We have provided a brief, and if you're happy, I'll do a short summary of that to maybe set the context. Thanks very much for inviting Clark and myself this morning. I'll provide a short overview of how the DLO expanded in 2013. I'll deal with the issues that you've specifically raised in terms of the questions and broadly update the committee about our future plans for the DLO. The Housing Executive carries out response maintenance services to approximately 88,000 homes through contracts linked to our district office network. And in 2012, we let 20 of these contracts to 7 external contractors. The following year, by mid-2013, we were faced with an unprecedented, unforeseen situation when in the period of just 3 months, 2 of our response maintenance contractors who were responsible for 8 contracts went into administration. Our priority at the time was to ensure continuity of service for our tenants, and our only option at the time was to take those contracts into the DLO together with the staff associated with those works. These were transferred to the Housing Executive under TUPE regulations, which maintain the same terms and conditions as the previous employment. It was always considered at that time that these arrangements would be temporary until new external service providers could be procured. However, having run the first competition, the preferred bidder claimed that the TUPE liabilities associated with these contracts were too onerous and they would not accept the contracts. It then became clear to the Housing Executive that other contractors would be in a similar position, particularly in relation to the TUPE liabilities. As a consequence, the Housing Executive decided that in order to maintain delivery of the service, the DLO would take over those contracts in each of the affected areas. At the time, we were also conscious that you were talking about 200 people who faced the potential of being made redundant. The Housing Executive was also aware that the 8 contracts being brought in the DLO was costly, and therefore we realigned some of those contracts, which led to the position whereby we tendered 3 of those, which were non-TUPE related, and they were successfully awarded to 2 contractors. Today, at the current time, the DLO continues to service the remaining 5 areas of those contracts in North Belfast, West Belfast, South Belfast, Portadown, Craigavon and Shankill, along with the existing contracts that we held in the other part of North Belfast and in Coleraine. You will see from the briefing that the DLO delivers a response maintenance service to about 30,000 properties, which is about a third of our stock, a third of the business. They employ 360 employees on response maintenance and a further 120 employees in relation to our ground service, our motor vehicle workshop and our health and safety inspections. Specifically, the committee raised questions in relation to TUPE and the transfer of staff into the DLO. Once the Housing Executive made the decision to bring the services relating to the affected contracts in-house, we are obliged to follow the requirements of TUPE. The TUPE regulations stipulate that staff are entitled to transfer with the work if immediately prior to that transfer they were assigned to an organised grouping of employees whose principal purpose was doing that work, and that's what happened. Transferring employees are entitled to transfer on the same terms and conditions and with the same continuous service as they enjoyed prior to that transfer. Our HR colleagues would carry out due diligence checks to ensure that all those people associated with these transfer were in fact doing that work. Today, those transferred staff are continuing to work under the terms and conditions that they transferred to the Housing Executive on. And this has resulted in the Housing Executive having to manage a range of terms and conditions, including pay, leave and working hours. The Housing Executive has worked to establish a fair and affordable method by which the TUPE staff can be offered Housing Executive terms and conditions. And to that extent, our board has now given approval for us as officers to enter into negotiations with the unions about standardising those terms and conditions. I'm happy to talk about that in some detail later. Certainly a favourable outcome to those negotiations will allow the Housing Executive's terms and conditions to be offered to all those TUPE employees who had transferred into the business. In terms of the costs of running the DLO, we've addressed some of the confusion, I think, about some of the early questions. There was confusion over a figure relating to 11.1 million. That figure provided related only to staff costs. The total running cost of the DLO today was 22.6 million, and we can talk about that later. And it's interesting to note that prior to the award of that contracts, the running costs for the DLO were about 7 million. So you can see there's been a tripling in the cost there. The figures given to the committee in our brief would show the breakdown of that. The committee also raised the issue about agency staff, and you can see that the DLO has always used agency staff, particularly around our grounds service, with fluctuations in seasonal demand, particularly around the spring and summer months. The number of agency staff has increased specifically as a result of these contracts collapsing, in that the appropriate skills did not transfer to the Housing Executive, because quite a significant amount of the work was being carried out by subcontractors. So when we inherited the contracts, there was no staff with some of these works, which resulted in us in having to recruit electricians, plasters, etc. to carry out those duties. I suppose I'd like to close my opening remarks about the work of the Board's Performance and Development Committee. The Board, given the scale of the DLO operation now, has set up a subcommittee of the Board whose sole role is to oversee the effectiveness and efficiency, the management, performance and governance of the DLO. This committee has 3 board members and 2 independent board members who have direct experience in maintenance environment and DLO contracts, and has helped provide a direct focus to the run of the DLO as a significant business. They've overseen in the last 12 months a restructuring of our depots, a restructuring of the staff workforce, contracts for vehicle procurement, and have helped point a direction in terms of trying to bring new technology to this service. The performance of the DLO is managed exactly the same as we manage the performance of all our other contractors. There's a set of KPIs, there's controls in place that we look to on every month. And it's worth noting for the committee that during 14-15, the DLO met all their KPIs. And in terms of getting jobs done and correct right first time, their performance is better than any of the external contractors. And moving forward, the Housing Executive is currently preparing for the introduction of new contracts in 2016. And with that in mind, we've got to revisit the lessons that we've learned from some of the issues we dealt with in 2012. And to that extent, we're sitting down with contractors and the construction industry to ensure we design new and improved contracts for the future. However, our priority is to ensure that the DLO continues to sustain high standards of quality service for our tenants, but equally we must ensure that the operational costs of the DLO are reduced in order to demonstrate that we're providing value for money. So in conclusion, that for 2013, the committee should know that we came across an unprecedented set of circumstances. 8 contracts collapsing within 3 months, which was the result of thousands of backlog of repairs being done. Our tenants weren't getting the service they should be entitled to. They pay their rent, and one of the primary benefits of paying your rent is you get a repair service. While we've focused over the last 12 months on quality and getting the quality up, it's obvious from the costs associated with that the DLO is an expensive operation. And our task over the coming years is to drive those costs down. And to that end, there's a clear focus from the committee to the officers to make sure we do that. And in order to ensure that, we're in the throes of recruiting a commercial head of the DLO to bring private sector experience to help us improve that position. We do see a real benefit in having the DLO, in that we now have a presence of the DLO in each of our 3 regions. And in order to protect against what's happened in 2012, we see having a presence of the DLO in each of those three regions is a positive thing. And I would finally just advise the committee that while the DLO is about 30% of our business, 70% of our response maintenance services are contracted out to the private sector. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Clark, do you want to?
No, Jerry's covered the main points. Happy to take questions.
And obviously the whole question of the DLO, the TUPE and the Cross, there's been concerns raised here, especially in around the terms and conditions, and it's good to hear that there's negotiations going on. Is there a time frame in the round? But some of these things drag on and on and on, and that certainly doesn't benefit people that may be sitting waiting on the outcome.
Post the approval by the board and negotiations, we met with Unite about 2 weeks ago, and in essence there are 3 proposals on the table. One is to introduce a standard working week of 37 hours, which is what applies to our employees and the DLO. Many of the people working for us are on contracts of 39 hours, 40 hours, 42 hours, which in many respects means that if a guy's on a 42-hour contract and is meant to start at 7 o'clock, we've had to have somebody there to allow him to start at 7 o'clock. So we've had a favourable reception to moving everybody to 37 hours. And alongside that, what we're trying to do is put everybody on a similar scale in terms of conditions. So if a plumber's on a scale of 0.10 to 0.20, all our plumbers should be on that scale. We are agreeing that we'll try to rationalise them onto the nearest point on the scale to have plumbers are all paid the same rate. And the last point would be in relation to future pensions, and that any new employees joining the DL organisation would be joining a separate pension scheme. Because we found that in trying to seek competition to this, once you're a housing safe employee, you're attached to a nil cost pension, which is a pretty generous scheme, but it's pretty expensive to run if you're running a private business. So those are 3 big terms and conditions we've entered into. We were tasked to go back to our board in 2 months. The unions want to try and do that earlier, and we are trying to work with them to get a favourable response from all our members to try and sign up these terms and conditions. And if we can do that earlier, then we will bring those proposals back to our board for endorsement, subject to getting a satisfactory outcome.
And can this committee be kept informed of how those discussions are? And I noticed that when you were speaking about the agency workers, that you don't see anything in the briefing paper about the amount of agency workers there are.
Yeah. There's about 100, I think it says 125, between 125 and 130 agency workers. And that was primarily driven by the fact that when we inherited the contracts back in from the private contractors, they had subbed a lot of that work out. Yeah. So the work came back, no staff transferred with it. So we actually had to go in and recruit staff on a temporary basis to fill those voids, particularly plasters and electricians, because you can't sustain the service without the staff. And unfortunately at the time in this, is at the peak of the recession, a lot of highly skilled people actually had left Northern Ireland to go and get work in other places. So it proved a bit of a challenge in terms of securing those resources, and we still have those resources today servicing these contracts.
Could it just before I go to members, you spoke about the DLO reaching all the KPIs, yeah. And but you also went on to speak about the additional cost that there is about having an internal organisation. I couldn't understand why if you were saying that on the one hand that the quality of work had improved in comparison to the past, and whether it's good to have a DLO, or you were saying that because it may be cost prohibitive that you needed to look elsewhere.
I suppose it's critically important for us as a public body to demonstrate value for money. And the clinical view would be that, well, if there's suddenly additional costs for the DLO on it, it must have been cheaper to have it outside, and that is true. All I would say to the committee is the experience of having all our contracts outside, people come in at the peak of the recession with very competitive prices, which resulted in 2 firms going to because they could not run the contracts at the prices they had offered. So we transfer the staff in, we tender for our materials every year, so the costs are the costs of running the jobs. What we're trying to do is try to be a bit more efficient in how we do things and be smarter in how we do things. But we recognise that when we tender again, there's an expectation that, given the experiences of what happened over the last number of years, that anybody interested in doing this business, which tends to be high volume, low cost, will reflect on what's happened over the last number of years with the contractors who'd been delivering this. There were various ranges of prices, and I suppose a lot of this is commercial and confidence, so I don't want to get into the details of that, but there was a significant range, and in some cases significant reductions in the standard schedule rates to do this work, which probably reflected pressure in the economy at the time for people wanting to maintain work. We brought it internally, we had to pay the costs, and the costs are what they are. And our first focus was to make sure we deliver a quality service for our tenants. Because we got ourselves in a position where there were a few thousand jobs in backlog, because people weren't getting their repairs done, change of tenancies weren't being done in time, which meant people on the waiting list weren't getting access to properties. That's not sustainable. So our focus was to get the work done quickly. We do acknowledge that there are costs associated with this, and in order to make the DLO competitive, we have got to find a way of driving those costs down. Otherwise, long term, it's not sustainable.
I'll give you one or two examples. Our employer's pension contribution is based on the NILGOS, like the rest of the housing executive and local government and parts of education, I believe. It's 20%. That represents £2 million employer's pension contribution. I understand that the standard generic construction industry scheme requires the employers to contribute about 4%. Now, the difference between 20% and 4% in our terms is 1.6 million. So that's a cost that we have to meet, but an external contractor wouldn't. And the public sector body, obviously, we put a high importance on compliance and governance issues. So that's built into the overheads. You know, while we've been in this period of adjustment, we've been leasing vehicles, and we're now moving to outright purchase. That will help us drive down costs. So the drive has been that we're very much committed to the mixed economy, but we do believe there are very real advantages to having an internal DLO. It gives us the backup, the resilience, the contingency. Certainly, our position is that we have an obligation, as Jerry has said, to be able to demonstrate that the DLO provides value for money. And the value for money would encompass both the quality aspects as well as the cost. So that's where we are at the minute, and there is a real drive to become a more efficient, more focused, more customer-focused DLO operation.
I have to say that's excellent to hear. One of the concerns that there was at the committee, and you touched on it there, is the whole tendering process, and that you mentioned it about people bidding low to get it. I think at one stage we were told that there may have been bids of under 30% below the contract just to maintain the bid. Has that changed? You know, but you still hear rumours of people maybe going 9, 10, 12% below the tender price.
Yeah, some of our contractors are in at negative rates. I'm not going to suffice to say they are. We've been doing a lot of work with the Construction Employers Federation, with a view moving forward to try and garner their support that as we move forward into these new contracts, where we see people coming forward with which are perceived to be significantly low prices, that we would have the support of the industry to stand beside them and say we are not accepting these contracts. You know, because if you do significant investigation and groundwork to determine what you believe to be a reasonable price, someone comes in with a bid which is significantly below that, they have got to demonstrate to us they can do the job for those rates. But I will go back and say that in 2012, suppose the prices reflected the recession, and people just, in many respects, wanted to keep continuity of work and keep guys in a job, and hence that reflected their prices. Some firms, given the scale of them, were probably able to carry those prices better than others. But that's one of the lessons we would have learned from that as we move forward, to make sure that the prices that are bid for these contracts actually are deliverable.
Okay, Jim?
Yeah, I understand you to say that at the present moment, 30% of our maintenance is in-house through the DLO and 70% is contracted out.
Yeah.
Now, we know that the 30%, the price of the DLO is about 22 million a year.
Yeah.
What's the 70% costing?
Well, we're spending about 45 million a year or something like that, Jim, in terms of the overall response maintenance. So if the DLO is costing us, say, 20 odd million, we're paying over 25 million outside.
So for 30% of the maintenance, we're paying 22 million.
Yeah.
And for 70% of the maintenance, we're paying 25 million.
Yeah, and I think you also should note, Jim, that in terms of the 22 million associated with running the DLO, that also includes our grounds maintenance service and our motor vehicle workshop, and we also do electrical inspections, so it's not just directed at all
Can you,
trades.
even in ballpark terms, subtract that to tell us what the real cost of the 30% maintenance that's in the house is?
Yeah, I could have a look at that during the meeting. If you give me a minute or two, I could try and look it up for you and come back to you.
Come back to me with that. When you, there obviously is a huge problem, even a moral problem. 2 years later, employees who are doing the same work within the housing executive, who, because they were tubied in,
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
paid a lot less on a lot more less advantageous terms and conditions. And to one extent, you could say that the housing executives had the advantage of cheap labour for 2 years. That can't go on.
I fully would accept that, Jim. At the end of the day, they have two individuals doing the same job. One maybe starting an hour earlier than one of his colleagues and finishing a bit later and getting paid less. Long
And
term
getting less holidays,
is unsustainable.
less pension contribution.
Some of the terms and conditions that people transferred into, some of the testimonies I believe you probably have received from Unite here, where people haven't seen a pay rise in 10 years, which reflected the market in which they were working. It's in our interest that we've always looked after our staff in the organisation. The DLO are part of the housing executive, and it's our objective to ensure that all the staff working in the housing executive are signed to the same terms.
But perpetuating that, allowing that to run for 2 years, has in fact itself enhanced your costs, because you said it yourself, if you've one two-big guy who starts at 7 and your DLO staff start at 8, you have to put in place an extra supervisor, you have to supervise a myriad of different contracts, so your overheads have been perpetuated
Short term, yeah, they have been.
by your own actions.
Yeah, they have been short term have been increased. One of the fundamental things I would say is that shifting the whole stupid workforce to a 37-hour week in and of itself would generate significant saving. Because bear in mind,
Would it pay for itself? Is it cost neutral?
the overall terms and conditions when we review them, moving everybody to a 37-hour week and putting them all to the same terms and conditions, the overall impact of that, Jim, is cost neutral.
Cost neutral.
One-
Right,
one
well,
would-
if it's
one would
cost
offset
neutral,
the
why
other.
have we not done it before now?
I suppose we spent the first 12 months of this was to try and get this thing up and working. If you remember, we transferred in hundreds of staff, no location from where to work, no vehicles. So our first objective was to try and keep this service going. So, and to that extent, we leased temporary accommodation. We've now got to a stage where we've got proper long-term leases and accommodation. We've acquired premises in Portadown. So our full objective in year one was just to get the service up and running.
But all those short-term steps were the most expensive steps you could take. Short-term lease is obviously a lot more expensive than a long-term. Short-term leasing on vehicles, likewise.
Yeah, and our immediate response at the time was to keep the service running. We always had the view that we want to put this back out. But then having established that, we went twice to the marketplace to try and
So let's
tender
come
this
to
work,
that.
and contractors didn't take it up.
Let's come to that. What now is the long-term view? Because I notice you're appointing a commercial director
Yeah.
to manage the DLO. All that suggests to me that you see a very long-term, expansive future for the DLO. And yet at the same time, you're telling us next year you're going out to tender again.
Yeah.
So which is the direction of travel?
So there's probably both, Jim, in terms of we do firmly believe that in having a DLO, which is value for money, is a good thing because it does provide a counter to having all your contracted work out in the private sector. But it has to be value for money.
But do you see the same ratio, 70-30?
And the issue there is just how big should our internal DLO be? And that is
What's the thinking on
And
that?
that's the challenge for us as we work towards the end of this year to reconstruct the maintenance contracts, in both in terms of not only their work content but the shape of them. We will take a view towards the end of the year. What's the best match for us?
But you must know where you're wanting to get to. Because next year you're going out to tender, you're appointing a commercial director. So the housing executive must know our target is to do a quarter of our maintenance, to do 20% of our maintenance, to do a third of our maintenance. What is that target?
There's no specific number set, Jim. Our objective would be to have a presence in each of our regions in terms of a DLO. We manage all our housing services across 3 regions. We now have a DLO presence in each of those 3 regions. It just would happen that predominantly in Belfast, all our maintenance work is done virtually by the DLO.
So you can't
would
help
argue
us.
that's not a good thing.
You can't help us post the tendering of 2016, post the appointment of commercial director and everything else. What are going to be the component parts of the breakdown between the DLO and the private sector?
Yeah.
I think you've just described where
Exactly.
we are in terms of our debate and consideration. We're developing a maintenance strategy which will inform how we take forward the procurement into next year. Appointing the commercial director is part of our initiative to make the DLO as efficient as we can. We do have an open mind. We realise that under whatever scenario, if there's a TUPE transfer or it remains in-house, we have to make sure we can demonstrate value for money. So over the short term, the emphasis will be improving the productivity, improving the efficiency, improving the cost effectiveness of the DLO, and that will then feed into our debate. And I think one of the critical questions, as you've highlighted, is what size should the DLO be going forward? We haven't reached that stage yet. That's part of our deliberations around the maintenance strategy.
The whole ongoing exercise about regularising the TUPE workers. If you regularise 200 TUPE workers or whatever, you're then creating a size, an existing size for the DLO, which if you then diminish, you're into redundancy and all sorts of issues. So you must have in your head a vision as to what size you actually think the DLO is going to be.
Not at this point. We're committed to making it efficient, but this is part of our thought process in terms of developing the maintenance strategy.
And when will all that crystallise for you?
Towards the end of this calendar year.
And meantime?
In the meantime, we start to focus on driving the costs of the DLO down.
Well, does that mean meantime you're going to string out the negotiations with Unite?
No.
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 I think we need to be clear on that message. The one thing we want to do with Unite is to bring those discussions to a very prompt conclusion. And the early response from them would be is that they are favourable to the suggestions we've made with a view to trying to get this closed as quickly as possible, Jim.
And I think the Chair asked you how quickly is that?
Yeah, we were tasked to try and come back to our own board in August, but Unite actually sat with us and said, look, is there any possibility of going to the July board? And I said, well, if we can get a response back from all your members on the proposals, then we will go back to our July board if that happens.
Thanks for now, Chair.
Dolores, you wanted on the report, sir?
It was just that same one as Jim, actually, about the direct labour organisation. You know, I can't for the life of me understand why the housing executive doesn't already know what its response maintenance schedule is, its budget is, and therefore what its workforce should be to deliver on. I would have thought that was quite elementary in terms of the management of the organisation overall.
We know exactly what the budget is. I
didn't say you didn't know what the budget. I know you know what the budget is, but I can't work out why you can't work out your workforce. And the budget then allows your response maintenance and the needs of the tenants. Seems to be a mismatch.
No, if I've understood your comment correctly, and I hope I have, what we're looking at is what is the best blend or mix to deliver a high quality, cost effective, reliable response maintenance service. Events we never planned to be where we are at the minute. That was happened through a series of events and what we thought was a sensible and realistic response to those events. But looking forward, we are engaged in a major piece of work looking at what is the best way for us to deliver a very valuable service, very important service to our tenants, and that work is underway as we speak.
But Chair, does that not raise issues around what the procurement decisions were? If people were coming in well underpriced, there's no way it was going to be delivered at. 3 firms go bust. You know, surely there are questions for those who make the procurement rules and whether it's always best to take the lowest price.
Well, I think that's been raised a number of times here in relation to the lowest price and the impact that has had. Roy?
Again, I'm just looking for some more direction on the TUPE regulations. The work's been brought in-house, the staff transferred. So are these all presently full-time region executive employees?
They are.
So clearly it's intolerable that you will get equality or you'll get discrimination cases coming up unless you regularise the contracts of employment for similar pay for similar work.
Yeah.
So this has to happen then.
Yeah, and if you get that, so when we're having staff meetings with the DLO, you've got people who TUPE'd in saying, well, are you a member of staff or are we a special member of staff? So our objective is to make sure they're all treated exactly the same.
Okay. I should point out there are some people who are on more generous terms and conditions as a result of the TUPE transfer.
Okay. interesting. Then just going back to your contract process, you seem to be saying that, and it seems to be that in the past, your tendering process resulted in poor quality of work, and yet even with that, the firms went bust because they couldn't afford to carry out the contracts at the prices that they had won their tenders at. I've limited experience of this, but I know, for instance, when Carrickfergus Council had tendered out work in the town hall, in some of their buildings, the quantity surveyors would go through and just check the tenders to make sure it was deliverable, and if the tender wasn't deliverable, if somebody had put in ridiculous prices that they couldn't generate, it wouldn't be deemed to be an appropriate tender. Did you not have any mechanism like that in your process?
Yeah, we did have, and particularly for those which were significant minuses, the contractors at the time, the bidding contractor would have been asked to explain how they're going to run the service for those prices. Would have been asked and would have provided responses at the time to do that. But it's fair to say at that time, the spread of prices in the main, most people were offering reductions. They were all offering reductions, which reflected the market at the time. People were chasing work. But quite quickly, in one of the cases, the firm found that they couldn't deliver the services. Because I think one thing, the committee members should know that along with these new contracts, at the time we introduced a set of KPIs, the result of which was to drive up performance and quality. If you didn't achieve the standard, there were penalties associated with not delivering, financial penalties. So keen price, coupled in some cases with a poor performance, which then followed a financial penalty, created additional pressures on some of the firms in delivering that.
Were these key performance indicators in the tender from the start?
Yeah,
Yes.
they were advised, yeah.
And the contractors should have submitted their prices based on those assumptions. And whether or not they did, we don't know, but we did challenge. Also, I'm not an expert in this particular, but I'm told by more informed colleagues that the procurement guidance has changed quite significantly over that period. And dealing with abnormally low bids, at that time certainly we did challenge, but if a contractor came back and gave an assurance they could deliver the service at that price, it would have been extremely difficult for us to reject it. But now there is much more robust guidance to help us make those decisions.
I was at a meeting earlier on today, and one of the aspects that was highlighted in terms of tendering, the concept of social value can be added, and some of that's about sustainability and bringing forth new apprentices, etc., etc. Will you be building into the new contracts some degree of sustainability, so we don't go for some quick buck contract for short-term benefit, but for long-term pain?
We've had, and maybe the committee would have received a copy, we had a recent gateway review completed on our response maintenance contracts, which concluded that at the time those contracts were a response to previous criticisms of how response maintenance was delivered and had achieved those targets, but long-term, were they sustainable? And the view was, no, they wouldn't be, and that we need to reflect that at the end of the day you're entering into a partnership. Partner providing the services there to make money. As a public body, you're there to make sure you get a quality product and its value for money. So that we need to critically look at those arrangements, the content of the work, the length and duration of the contracts, the type of work that's in those contracts, and those will all be built in as we move forward. And there was a view at the time that you go for high percentage in terms of cost and lower percentage in quality. You know, we would take the view that we need to look at the balance in terms of quality is very important as you move forward. Also be mindful of the cost. So we shouldn't be chasing a solution which is lowest cost gets the ticket.
I just recently examined a new building in a different aspect of public sector, and I was advised that in the past 2 years there's been numerous times the maintenance departments had to be called out because of faulty door handles in a 2-year-old building. And I imagine each time there's a carpenter arrives out, it costs more than what a high quality new door handle would cost. So will you be ensuring that the quality of the material used is appropriate? So again, you don't go for short-term wins for long-term financial costs?
Yes. It's a short answer, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Jerry, do you see in terms of any arrangement that might be made between the unions and the housing executive and moving this whole process forward.
Yeah.
Will that have an impact on any future, or was any future contractors or employers that were being tubied across? Will they come in at the existing agreements that they had, or will they come on and under the DLO agreement?
If we secure agreement in the next 2 months in terms of terms and conditions, those are the terms and conditions that would be associated with that group of staff. So whether we keep them or some version of it goes outside, those conditions would transfer to anybody who would be bidding
They
for
would
that service.
automatically.
They're automatically protected and would have to be protected by law.
The existing staff would be.
Yeah, they have to be protected by law.
And
And it's incumbent on us, if we got in a position where some of that work was going outside, it's incumbent on us to share that information with any prospective contractor.
All
who'd be looking
future staff that may come in.
all future staff, part of the negotiations is that they would have the same terms and conditions with the exception of that pension element. Because many of the staff actually, well not many, some of the staff in the DLO have been saying that their contribution to an ILGOS pension scheme is quite challenging.
Is any,
Just a final point, sorry, Chair. In terms of who the contractors were, was it the case that you got some of the big firms contracting for the work and then subcontracting it out and then making the individual staff be self-employed? And was that not a form of employment practice that should actually be frowned upon whenever you're setting the contract? Because that's what's happening, and then they're walking away when it goes bust.
Don't know the details. In one case, I'm reasonably confident in saying no, they didn't do that. In the second contractor, we know they did use subcontractors to a large extent.
And how does that form part of your contract setting? You know, that everybody's taking a slice of the cake, and the losers are the direct labour worker and the service user with maybe a poor standard or quality of service or material.
I think that's maybe part of the discussion in Dolores about the quality side of things as we move forward. You know, how can we challenge prospective contractors bidding for our services? Tell us about your infrastructure. Let's go and see your infrastructure in terms of how you run your business. Is it a shell, or do you actually have a workforce that went with it? Because we've pointed out some of the contracts we got when we got the work back, there was no staff associated with it, so it was all subbed out. Your question, Jim, I think it's about, Jim had asked me a previous question about,
Yes.
I think it's about 17 million.
But
Something in
Can we confirm that? Ed, a quick bit of
So,
arithmetic?
I think it's about
I'm
70.
going to hold you to it, but for now, you're saying
The
30% of the maintenance response, which is done in-house, is costing 17 million, and 70% is costing.
And the rest is
25.
whatever the balance is in the I can provide you with the exact figures, Jim, after the meeting, if that's all right.
Just a couple of other miscellaneous points, just to tie up a couple of things. If you complete your negotiations with Unison about with Unite about the existing two-bid staff,
Yes.
what will be the start date for those staff in terms of their length of service with the housing executive?
Their length of service is when they tube it across.
Be protected from the date they transferred it.
So they'll be protected from that date. There's no question about that.
That's my understanding, Jim, I'll confirm that for you.
Yeah. I think that's obviously important, particularly in a scenario where there's uncertainty about whether you're going to be diminishing the DL or not. Secondly, in the 2 years, have the two-peat staff tended to stay with you, or has there been a hemorrhaging of them?
Yeah, I can't be 100% in this, but my understanding is that the staff that transferred with us have largely remained.
Yes, I believe.
Does that reflect, or let me put it another way, within those staff, do you think their collective desire is to be retained by the housing executive?
My general view would be that the mood of the staff who joined the housing executive from private contractors want to stay with the housing executive. I can't vouch for every single person, but the general collective would be...
And what has been the tenant response?
Generally, the level of tenant satisfaction with our repair service is pretty good. It's pretty good. You always get the exception, and the contracts I think are pitched that performance should be at 90%, so there's always a market there for people who get a failing service, but generally our scores in terms of tenant satisfaction are very high.
And how does that compare with the contracted out?
Similar, I'll have to say, in the main, our private contractors deliver a good quality service as well, Jim. you know, generally speaking, our response maintenance service is in a much better place than it
Well, I
was
suppose
3 years
as
ago.
public representatives, we probably tend to hear
You would
more
know.
about the cases of dissatisfaction.
Yeah, and we get those, and you know, you could argue one of those cases is one too many, but it does happen. When you think about it, it's high volume, low value work, and things do go wrong. And the challenge for us is that when they go wrong, to learn from the things that went wrong. But I'd have to say I wouldn't want the committee to be misinformed. Generally, the performance of all our response maintenance contractors is pretty good.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Jerry, Clark, thank you very much for your briefing.
Thank you.
I have no doubt that we'll be seeing this sometime in the future.
Thank you all.
We will now have a departmental briefing on social housing reform development and the social housing rent policy. Could the officials come forward? And I'd like to welcome Jim Wilkinson, Director of Housing, Paul Price, Deputy Director of Housing, and Dr. Heloise Brown, Head of Policy Research and Legislation, DSD. These are very welcome. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chair. Thanks, Committee, for the opportunity to provide you with an update on the development of a social housing rent policy for Northern Ireland, which is obviously one of the strands of the social housing reform programme. As the Chair has mentioned, I'm joined today with Dr. Paul Price, who's the Programme Director, and Dr. Heloise Brown, who's Head of Policy and Research. I'll start by providing some short background on the need for and the development of a social housing rent policy. I know we've given the committee quite a range of material on this issue, which is both, I suppose, complex and extensive, and therefore, given the time constraints, my colleagues and I will provide a brief update on the papers and the key points from our policy proposals. Current practice has led to quite wide variations in the rents that social housing tenants pay. At the moment, people in a housing executive or housing association home seem to be paying quite different levels of rent for similar types of property. I suppose one of our starting points was that there needed to be more fairness, consistency and transparency in the system. I suppose that's quite relevant when you consider that access to social housing through the Common Selection Scheme and assessment of need can lead to an individual being offered the next available suitable home, which can either be in the housing association or in the housing executive stock. There can be quite differences in rent levels. Beyond rent, it's also important to reflect on the nature of social housing those rents apply to. Housing association homes tend to be newer, be more energy efficient and have lower outgoings, and have been in part funded through private finance. In this context, it's probably worth pointing out that our research has indicated that housing association rents in Northern Ireland are broadly comparable with housing association rents in other parts of the UK, providing a similar standard of accommodation. Housing executive homes tend to be older, require more maintenance, and as the committee will be aware from previous briefings, are in need of significant investment. Maybe just to touch on that, in 2009, Savills were appointed by a department to undertake a stock condition survey based on delivering a minimum standard forecasted and investment requirement in the next 30 years for the housing executive of about 5.1 billion. A desktop update in 2009, when we started this social housing reform programme, suggested that investment growth had been grown to potentially somewhere between 6.1 billion and 6.6 billion. You may be aware we're carrying out with the housing executive a very extensive survey at the moment. And those initial findings, while not yet finalised, suggest that investment might be up to about 6.7 billion, and that's something obviously we're looking at as in a wider context of reform. But what it does do is point to a significant investment gap. The primary sources for addressing any gap in investment for public housing is really from income from house sales, additional government funding or from rent, and the committee will be well aware that in terms of house sales and indeed government funding, there have been significant challenges. Since 2008, when the property collapse, the house sales programme within the housing executive has not delivered any significant quantum of investment. And in the current economic climate, there are a number of demands for very limited capital budgets. Maybe pointed out in housing, one of the most obvious is the priority given between increasing new stock through new build or investing in existing stock. If we look at the information we have on past trends in housing executive rent and compare the current rent level, not only with the housing executive and housing association sector in Northern Ireland, but maybe with comparable council rents in the north of England, we can see that over the last 12 years, since around 2003-04, NIHE rents, which were at that time comparable to council house rents in North East, West England and East Midlands at around £43, have significantly fallen behind those areas. In 12-13, the average NIHE rent was £58 compared to those same areas where it was around £68. Clearly, if one of the purposes of a rent policy is to ensure there's sufficient funding to meet investment needs and deliver quality homes, we obviously need to consider very carefully the impact of any social housing rent proposals on NIHE rent levels and NIHE tenants, and as you can see, we've devoted a particular section to that in our consultation paper and proposals. In any discussion about rent levels, we can't ignore the fact that issue of housing benefit, given that about 78% of all social housing tenants are in receipt of either full or partial housing benefit. And the papers the committee have got give an awful lot of detail on that. But just to remind members that during our initial discussions with you in September 2014, we indicated that whilst the percentage of the Northern Ireland population drawing down housing benefit is slightly above the UK average at about 11.2% compared to around 10% in the UK as a whole, the average amount claimed per claimant is significantly lower than the rest of GB. For example, the weekly housing benefit expenditure per claimant is £64.60 in Northern Ireland compared to UK average of 19. Now that's across all sectors. That's just not social housing, that's the private rented sector as well. Obviously, the levels of drawdown reflect differing housing market costs in the respective jurisdictions, but lower social rents levied, particularly by the Housing Executive, will also partially explain the lower drawdown. The differences are not accounted by household income, as our analysis indicates that the average NI household income is much lower than elsewhere in GB. As noted when we talked to you in September, if the drawdown of housing benefit per claimant in Northern Ireland was similar to Scotland or Wales, so we're trying to ignore the south of England as not being particularly representative, this would lead to possibly increased housing benefit subsidy to Northern Ireland public housing sector of about £40 to £50 million per annum. In terms of our proposed rent policy, when we briefed you in September on our initial research to inform it at the rent policy, we gave a commitment to undertake further analysis and brief the committee before the draft proposals were published for consultation, and that's really the purpose of today's briefing. I'll talk briefly about some of the research we've done, and before I hand you over to Paul, who'll take you through some of the details of the proposals we've put before you. Since our last committee meeting, there's been a significant amount of research to better inform the development of a rent policy. The Department, with the help of one of the consultants we have working, undertook an exercise with NIHE and housing associations to gather information on each social landlord's rent policy, the rents they charge, and issues such as service charges. This was in the form of their rent rules, which give information on type, size and location of property, applicable rents, rates and service charges. We also got the Housing Executive's rent rule, which included some 88,000, as Jerry's indicated, that's rolled through the stock. And officials also accessed the NIHE's Rents Point scheme, which is publicly available on their website. We think there are some important principles that a social housing rent policy should cover. Generally speaking, we're trying to achieve a social housing rent policy where rents are fair, affordable and transparent for all tenants who pay them, but also bring in enough income to help maintain good quality homes to a good standard and service any borrowing that the social landlord has incurred in the provision of these homes. Obviously, the Housing Executive has borrowing to service, and so do housing associations. Therefore, the key principles underpinning our proposals are fairness, have a right to expect the rent they pay is fair compared to other people. Affordable means people's social housing should be able to meet the cost of renewing their home. Sustainable, that the rent people pay needs to be enough to ensure their landlord can keep their home in good condition now and in the future. Transparent, that tenants should be able to easily find out how the rent is defined, what it covers and how it compares with what people pay in other situations. And we also think another importance is predictability. Social landlords, lenders and tenants should have some certainty over future rent levels and the direction where they're moving. I'll now pass over to Paul, who'll take you through some of the detail of those proposals.
Thanks. So, to meet those principles, we developed some options, and as agreed with the committee, we included within those option 1, change nothing, and an option 2, minimal changes. We considered a range of other options, but in the interest of brevity, I won't go through all of those. They're contained in the annexes to the document. So, following 2 confidential pre-consultation exercises with key stakeholders, all of these options were considered and amended and sifted to produce a single option, which is the heart of our proposal today, consisting of 7 related elements. Now, these are set out in the draft consultation document that you've got there. Now, I will talk through these 7 elements of this proposal in more detail. We envisage the policy that they collectively represent applying to the housing executive and to housing associations. Though, as Jim has mentioned, there is one element that is specific to the housing executive. So the first element of the proposal is that every social landlord, so the housing executive and every registered housing association, must have a rent policy. This would require landlords to publicly show how they set and increase the rent and service charges for their own tenants. It would require that they engage with tenants in the development of that policy. The second element is there must be more transparency on service charges. So the rent policy that a landlord must produce should include how service charges are treated, particularly if they are pooled across all tenants or applied only to those tenants who benefit from them, and if they are applied at cost. All of this information should be made clear for tenants within the policy. The third element, a benchmark rent will be defined by the Department for the average social home. This term of benchmark rent is being used. What we mean by this is an indication of an affordable and appropriate rent for the average social home, taking everything into consideration, and I will go into a bit more detail about this shortly. We propose that the benchmark rent for the average social home at 14-15 prices would be £90.27 per week. The fourth element is that every social landlord must have regard to the benchmark rent. This would mean each social landlord, in setting their rents in line with their rent policy, must ensure that there are reasonable differences in rents charged between properties of different quality, size and types. So in some cases, tenants should expect to pay a lower rent than the benchmark, and others should have to pay a higher rent than the benchmark. The fifth element is the regulator, currently the department, must check that each social landlord's rent policy is part of the financial and consumer standards of the regulatory framework, consultation on which has just closed. So if a social landlord's rent or annual rent increases appear to be high compared to the benchmark rent, the regulator will look in detail and more detail at how the landlord is meeting the financial and consumer standards that comprise the new regulatory framework. The sixth element of the proposal is the benchmark rent would be updated each year. It must be updated each year. And we propose that the annual increase to the benchmark rent is based on the Consumer Prices Index rate of inflation in the September before the increase is applied, plus 1.5%. And the seventh element of the proposals is that the housing executive rents should gradually rise to reflect the benchmark rent. So this will involve the gradual increase of housing executive rents until they have converged with the level they need to reach, the benchmark rent. Now, we're clear in the draft consultation document that housing associations are not expected to treat the benchmark rent as a target or increase their rents solely to it. The key function of the benchmark rent in this respect is to bring the housing executive rents into line with housing association rents here and public and social rents elsewhere. I'll just talk about two further elements really in relation to those seven elements, particularly first the benchmark. So the benchmark rent applies to the average social home in Northern Ireland. The average social home is a 3-bedroom house of average standard and thermal efficiency. We believe that homes that are smaller, are flats or apartments or of a poor standard or low thermal efficiency should cost less than the benchmark rent. Homes that are larger or are a very high standard or a high level of thermal efficiency should cost more than the benchmark rent. It is proposed that benchmark rent applies to all social landlords. Housing associations should not increase their rent solely to achieve the benchmark rent. It is an indicator of the affordability of rent levels. However, it is also proposed that it is not reasonable to require absolute conformity with the benchmark, where a social landlord has a rent policy that delivers rents for this average property within a small margin of the benchmark. This would be acceptable. It would also be the case where social landlords have stock that is of significantly higher quality or better thermal efficiency than the average, they would of course be justified in applying a higher rent because these homes will cost less to heat than the average social home. It's worth noting that in pre-consultation with landlords on this proposal of a benchmark rent, the housing associations and the Federation expressed concerns about the benchmark rent proposal. They felt that housing associations may inevitably be placed under pressure to align with the benchmark rent. They have concerns about whether this is interfering with the autonomy of individual boards to take decisions on rent levels, and that's worth noting. I'll say one final thing about affordability. So we propose gradual increases in housing executive rents towards the benchmark rent. Now, we consider these broadly affordable for reasons set out in detail in the document. A considerable body of analysis has gone into this at this stage. But in summary, a range of reasons why we broadly consider this proposal affordable. Firstly, that tenants in the private rented sector who are entitled to housing benefit receive it at a level known as the local housing allowance. This allowance sets out the maximum housing benefit that will be paid by number of bedrooms required by the household across 8 areas within Northern Ireland. For 3-bedroom properties, so for our average social home, whether houses or flats and regardless of quality, LHA ranges from £87.80p in the southwest area to £103.03p in the southeast area, in the 8 areas. So a benchmark rent for the social sector of £90.27 would therefore be broadly consistent with these rent levels and the level of government support provided to private tenants. Secondly, of course, for those 78% of housing executive tenants in receipt of partial and full housing benefit, it can be assumed that if their income remains otherwise unchanged, their housing benefit will cover any increase in the rent. Thirdly, that then leaves a group, 22-23% of tenants, of housing executive tenants, who pay all of their rent themselves. And this is where affordability needs particular consideration. Tenants who entirely pay their own social rent do so because their household income exceeds housing benefit thresholds. Now, what do we know about such incomes? Well, 30% of all housing executive tenants have a household income of £20,800 a year or more. 17% of a household income of £26,000 or more. Logically, of the 23% who pay all their rent, a large part must come from these higher income groups. So with such incomes, are the rents we propose affordable, particularly if we accept the definition of affordability as 30% of household income? And we've looked at some cases of this and they're annexed to our proposals. And to pull out a few, based on housing benefit income thresholds, the benchmark rent of £90.27p for a 3-bedroom house would, for most households, result in acceptable rent-to-income ratios. 15-16 benefit rates and £90 per week rent would mean that a lone parent with 2 children would need an income of almost £19,000 per year before they were no longer in receipt of housing benefit. So at this income level, a £90 rent would be 25% of their income. A couple with 2 children would need an income of over £21,000 per annum, and the rent at that level would be 22% of their income, the rent of £90. Also, figures published by NEFA in 2011 suggest that 84% of housing association tenants feel the rents they are charged represent good value for money. The Housing Executive Survey of its tenants indicate that under normal annual rent increases, 95% of tenants who pay their own rent do not anticipate difficulty in making their rent payments over the coming 12 months. The housing association rents aggregate that are at the 80th percentile of housing association rents. That is the level at which our benchmark rent is proposed. So broadly speaking, in the housing association sector, the kind of rent levels we are proposing are afforded. And as we've already observed, in terms of government intervention into tenants in the private sector, they bear comparison as well. So notwithstanding our broad expectation that our proposals are affordable for housing executive tenants, we do wish to know more about this, particularly this 23% of tenants who currently pay all of their rent themselves. So concurrent with this consultation, we are commissioning research on that issue, on that group, from the housing executive. Finally, a EQIA is attached with the document. In summary, it proposes there is no evidence of any major negative effect on any particular Section 75 group by any of the proposals of the rent policy, But going forward, each social housing landlord should gather this type of information to enable them to carry out necessary equality screening and an EQIA, if necessary, on social housing rent policy that this policy proposes must have. So I'll just pass back to Jim to conclude.
Honestly, this is a sort of complex, it is a complex area. We've spent quite a lot of time on it, and I'm clear we've bombarded me with an awful lot of facts, and there's an awful lot of detail in those papers. But it is a very important area. Obviously, we'd be keen to get the committee's views on it. Our intention would be thereafter to move to full public consultation on the rent policy. Much dates yet to be confirmed, but if it were to issue over the summer, we would give it a 16-week consultation paper. It's clearly a very important issue. We'll also be accompanied by the draft EQIA as well as regulatory and rural and human impact screenings. To ensure genuine and meaningful consultation, we will be issuing the consultation document. We've also produced an easy read version, which we've done for a number of the social housing reform policies, and I have to say they've been well received by groups and tenants and individuals. We'll also be providing supporting information on our website, and we'll be doing as many public engagements and tenant engagements as we can as part of that consultation process. And again, we always welcome the committee's views on how that might be done and how that might be improved. Thank you for listening to what was quite a sort of complex presentation and quite lengthy, and we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for the presentation. As you say, it was an excellent presentation, and we've come to expect that, obviously, when you appear in front of the committee, and it's certainly there's a lot of food for thought within the presentation itself. But if I could just kick-start the thing, and it just the setting of a benchmark rent has raised concerns among housing associations that this is essentially a target rent and will hinder their ability to raise money in order to build new social homes. Could you explain why you think these are unfounded, and conversely, what will be done to ensure rents are not set too high a level for above the benchmark?
I'll bring Heloise in some of the detail of why we believe the benchmark rent is the appropriate route. First of all, it's general. It's based on a general type of property, on an average property, and it's also based on where housing association rents are at the moment. In fact, on the 80th percentile. So there's a lot of scope to move. Secondly, it's very close to local housing allowance. We use, at the moment, there is no rent policy for housing associations. The board set their own rent. However, there is a rent assessment when we fund new build. When we fund a new build scheme and work out our level of grant, we do a calculation which includes a total cost indicator. So we look at the site, we assess the cost of developing the site, we assess the cost of borrowing that the association has to make, and how we assess that level of borrowing is that we assume the rent will never exceed 85% of local housing allowance. So when we do our original calculations, we put that figure in, and therefore we say, well, if you're going to charge a rent of X, the building cost is Y. With that rent, you can borrow Z. We'll fund the balance. So we do use those calculations. So all those seem to triangulate for us. And the other element of it is that we have, we believe, left significant discretion and ability for boards to justify the rents they're charging, and if it's in excess, to explain that. Our view would be that's probably a fair and reasonable expectation of a landlord. But Heloise did an awful lot of work on the calculation of this.
To get the benchmark, we literally took all of the housing association rent data that we got, so it's based purely on the association rent data, and these are organisations that are running and charging rents that are sustainable for them as organisations, so we just looked at the association rents, ordered them lowest to highest, and looked at really where the average properties fall, so you get a small number of very large properties. You get a significant number of newer properties that are very high quality, particularly post-2012 building standards. They're expected to have a higher level of thermal efficiency. And we looked at the 80th percentile, and we looked at comparisons with local housing allowance, what happens across the rest of the UK in terms of both the private sector and social sector in terms of housing associations and public housing. And that £90 level, which is literally ordered from lowest to highest, 80% of the housing association rents are below £90.27 a week. So 20% of them, 1 in 5, are above that level. So 80% of housing association tenants should look at that benchmark rent and see that their rents are lower than that. And that level is to say, at that level, we believe it's affordable. Compared to those other sectors, other jurisdictions, that level appears to be affordable for the household types that would reasonably accommodate a 3-bedroom house. which is the average type of social stock that's available in Northern Ireland. So that was how we identified the benchmark. Obviously, there's a wide range of rents in association rents, but that was felt to be a point where it approximated to what is paid in other sectors and other jurisdictions.
Tell me, to see all housing associations, do they operate at the same rent levels? Or each of them they set their own rent levels? And the likes of the price of land additions to the estate could have an impact on the level of rent that they would set them. Just that
that's one of the things you'll see in the consultation. Now, one of the things you found was that when every association had a rent roll and knew how much they charged everybody, not every association had a well-published and clear rent policy. And it varies. So some associations do what the Housing Executive do, have a point scheme and equalise rents across Northern Ireland, so they balance it all out. It doesn't matter if your house costs much more to build than a rural house, they'll even it out. Some will do it scheme by scheme. So the rent for a particular area will be set on the cost of that developing out that scheme. Others will group it in different regions. So what we're saying is that one of our initial consultations was should we set a common rent policy for Northern Ireland? And the answer was no. The better approach is that whoever's setting the rent policy should have the freedom to do it. They should have due regard to certain parameters within that rent policy, but most importantly, they should publish it and explain to tenants what it is.
Yeah, and is the point of this whole exercise to get a comparable rent between the private rented sector, which are the biggest providers of socially rented housing at present, housing associations and the Housing Executive?
No, I mean, we go back to the proposals were driven by those principles, fairness, transparency, and we're focused on the social housing sector. Now, in drawing the parameters around it in some of our proposals, we've taken cognizance of where social housing rents are at the moment, both in the Housing Executive and in housing associations, and we've also been aware of where housing benefit supports those accessing private rented sector. Now, in the private rented sector is slightly different in that rent levels in the private rented sector are not local housing allowance levels. Local housing allowance levels are the levels that government will provide housing benefit to, which is based on the lowest 30th percentile. And we're saying, so these social rents we're proposing, to put it another way, are lower than the lowest 30th percentile of the private sector, but we're saying should support quality homes with high energy efficiency. So that's where we're putting our affordable mark.
And I know that you mentioned the local housing allowance, but in many areas that rely on housing benefit, that has a direct impact on what the private renter sector offer and their tenants are paying. But I think obviously many people believe it's overpriced and overrated, but I think that's an argument for another day. It's concerning that out of the 22 housing associations that agreed to take part in the evidence gathering exercise on rent policy, only 10 provided information, and this, in your own words, varied widely in the level of detail provided. Have we been able to ascertain why this was the case and how this lack of transparency has shaped the rent policy proposals?
Well, I'll how is one that's involved in the research.
We did agree with all of those HAs to get the rent policies. We chased a lot of them, and that was how we got as many as we did. Any of the HAs we spoke to would say that they have policies in place and they're very clear on what they are, and their tenants are clear on what they are, and they were very clear with us about that. But it was still difficult with, between emails and follow-up phone calls to get some of the HAs to actually supply those rent policies.
What message does that send out of the people that you're dealing with and you pay a substantial grant to? Doesn't provide, and what is the department a very important exercise that they're now embarking on?
I suppose for us, and to sort of balance that, I think, there's one element which is about the provision of information. The provision of information was relevant for two purposes. It was to help us inform our policy, but it was also to help them shape the policy. So, if there's concerns about clarity of information, we based it on the information we had. But at the same time, I have to say, and Eloise will support me in this, those associations varied significantly in size, and a lot of the large associations fully engaged and supported the process. So there's a difference between the number of policies and the number of tenants covered is important. And secondly, I would say that both the Federation and a number of the large leading associations engage very proactively in discussions and debates and at meetings and provide us with information and challenge us on some of the issues as we draw up that policy. So, you know, it is concerning that we didn't get rent policies of the 24 or 25 we have. The numbers are different between the number of tenants that they had and the number of impacts it has. Obviously, we're putting our proposals out. If we go out to consultation, the associations and the sector will have another opportunity to respond formally to the consultation on that.
I want to come back to after members come in just on the consultation itself and how it will be handled in the aftermath. But Dolores.
Chair, it's just there's some press releases out today in relation to a debate that's taken place in GB, and particularly from the London Government and the Joseph Rowntree Trust in relation to a living wage and about affordable homes. And I just wondered, had you factored any of that new thinking into your deliberations?
Well, I know Eloise has, because she's mentioned the just Rowntree for reiteration, and it's referenced in the consultation document, but Eloise will.
I mean, the structure is now slightly different in England because they have a social rent and they have an affordable rent, and those are defined slightly differently. So an affordable rent in the English context won't mean the same as it means in Northern Ireland. But we have looked in detail at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's minimum income standard research, and that aims to look at all the costs that a household would have to see what they need to live on. And the latest information that came out earlier in the year that we looked at was giving rental costs, and it has traditionally been based on social rents. But Joseph Rowntree Foundation have started to build in the cost of private renting because social housing is becoming more difficult for many households to access. But again, where they're coming out at with those rental levels is around £89 for single or couple household and around £91 for small family. So again, we felt that gave us an independent level of assurance that that benchmark rent for a 3-bedroom home, which would usually have a small family living in it at that £91 rate, is about an appropriate level that is not too far away from what is in practice elsewhere across the UK.
Chair, could I just ask, I never can get my head around this, but Clonmel Housing Association were able to draw down something like £20 million or something like that to build affordable homes, which seemed to me very similar to a co-ownership type scheme. Am I right in thinking that? And then how would that type of scenario be managed?
So it's all to do with words. I mean, so as Eloise described, what we are talking about today is probably best looked at as what is a general affordable social rent and what should it provide. We also use the phrase affordable home ownership. Now, affordable home ownership is where primarily it's shared equity. So an individual owns part of the home and a housing association owns the other part, and eventually the individual can buy out, step out of that. The traditional model has been the co-ownership model, which is based on the individual picking the home they want, going to co-ownership, securing part mortgage and securing funding from co-ownership, so the individual picks the home. The other models we were keen to explore, and the committee's asked us about this a number of times, was can you do a shared equity model that involves new build? So Clonmel Housing Association, Apex Housing Association, and I think one of the others, bid to us for some loan funding, not grant, loan funding to try and build.
Yes.
So they want to build the homes, sell half the home.
Yes.
And it's a slightly different model.
But the rental part of that then
Yes.
would come in under your
Well, the rental
association?
part wouldn't come in under the rental part wouldn't necessarily come in under the social rent because it's not a social rent. The rental part falls under we have a piece of legislation that defines affordable housing, and it's to simplify it. The mortgage and the rent must be cheaper than if you had a mortgage for it all. So that's how
Yes.
the calculation works.
Yeah.
So it's not quite the same, something slightly different.
Just think, Chair, it might be a useful presentation to get a briefing on, because I'm not too sure.
On affordable shared equity housing, yes,
yeah,
we can certainly do
because
that.
I'm not too sure how much work or how successful that has been, or how well publicised it is as something for people trying to get their first step on the ladder. And I think it's regrettable that under the Regeneration Bill there was an opportunity, I think, lost, to enable local authorities to work with the likes of Clonmel and some of the housing associations and yourselves to use some of the land that's quite a bit of it, particularly in my constituency, in public ownership of the local authority.
I'd certainly hope that, I don't think the legislation would necessarily, we would certainly look moving forward that those sort of partnerships and activities could happen.
Chair could maybe could look then at having a briefing at a.
Yeah, certainly a welcome
Okay.
briefing on shared ownership or co-ownership. I think in all of it, we need to remember also that we're sitting on with a waiting list of 40,000 for social housing and less than 500 for shared ownership. So you need to get the balance right when we're dealing with it.
Yeah.
Sammy.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. And I think it was in September, I think it was, that you had said that the lower rent increase in Northern Ireland sees rents now significantly below the rent in some regions in England, with which you were previously on a par.
Yeah.
And could you explain a wee bit more about that in terms of even the income levels, obviously, in those regions compared to Northern Ireland?
The regions that were picked, I mean, we were very conscious that when we wanted to do any comparisons, and we do comparisons with England in particular, we choose areas that have a similar population, similar income levels, similar sort of needs. So the areas we picked are mostly north of England regions, where the income levels would be broadly comparable. As we've said, Northern Ireland average income in GB as a whole is slightly lower, but within those regions it was broadly comparable, and they're the areas we picked. So what we're saying is in 2002, I think was the figure, Housing Executive was charging about £43, those regions, and there were council houses we wanted. We didn't look at housing, so council houses were charging about 43. 10 years later, those council houses are charging about 68 and the housing executive is about 58, so it's about £10 a week difference.
Yep.
Now there's a whole variety of reasons for that. One reason is that, as members will be aware, really prior to 2008, the Housing Executive ran a quite significant capital investment programme. A lot of that was funded through house sales, and house sales stopped. There was a gap. It's also true that in England there was a social housing rent policy in place, which for council houses moved an element of convergence like we have implemented, that we're proposing for the Housing Executive. So some of those started to increase. But, I mean, at that level of difference, you know, £10 additional for the Housing Executive, I think, could mean an extra 20, 30 million money to invest. You know, and you heard the presentation before, because it's worth noting that the Housing Executive's landlord function, those response maintenance contracts, plant maintenance, at this point in time are completely funded by their rental income. There's only a very modest capital budget available to them.
Yeah, again, Chair. Following on from that, in terms of the similarities between Scotland and Wales, and I think you were saying that if there were the levels of rent were the same, there could be an increased subsidy in Northern Ireland of, I think you mentioned, 40 to 50 million pounds. Is that a long-term goal or an aspiration of this?
But I think we're very clear. I mean, what we're looking at is, you know, we've looked at a rent policy in terms of an affordable level, openness, transparency, and lets landlords do what they need to do to present houses. And then we've said there are certain things we know. So, for example, we've said we know that 77 to 78% of tenants receive full or partial housing benefit. So, therefore, we know that an increase in rent will be met by a consequential increase in housing benefit. And we know that that housing benefit comes from the Exchequer. It doesn't come from the Northern Ireland Assembly. And we're saying, therefore, putting that aside, we've looked at housing benefit in England, Scotland and Wales, and that if the per capita drawdown of housing benefit in Northern Ireland was of a similar level to the per capita drawdown of housing benefit in Wales, there would be an extra 40 million to 50 million in housing benefit paid into the Northern Ireland sector.
But that's based on the levels of rental income in Scotland and Wales.
Yes,
here we have 20, I think I can read this here, 23% of the Housing Executive tenants pay all of the rent themselves, and 14 receive partial housing benefit.
Yes.
That's nearly 40%. And I would imagine, or maybe you could give us the figures, what percentage that 40% would be low-income families, you know, low-paid jobs. And again, the reason why I'm asking that is that obviously we're going through austerity at the moment.
Yes.
Of another £12 billion pounds of cuts across United Kingdom welfare, and other cuts to even own departments here. Do you factor that in? Because I mean, there's going to be more and more pressure on people many who come out of my own office are struggling at the moment to make ends meet.
What we've tried to model, and it is very complex, that 23%, it's very, very complex to get a lot of detail about their household makeup because they're not actually in receipt of housing benefits. So the housing executive isn't dealing with them as a housing benefit recipient. They just know they're dealing with them as a tenant who pays their rent. Paul gives some facts and figures around what some facts and figures that were known about housing executive tenants' wage levels, and made an assumption that some of the higher wage levels are presumably those people are paying their rent. We did two things in our modelling. It was beyond me to understand it, but there's a table in there which shows that if you increased rent and people's wages didn't change, when would they lose housing benefit? And for a high percentage of that, 14% who are impartial, that if rent levels went up but their wages didn't, their housing benefit entitlement would move up partially to meet that gap. There's also, and we can't create that, there would be potential assumption if someone's on a particularly low wage, low working wage, that an increase in rent might trigger access to housing benefit that currently is excluded because of the rent. But that is an area that we want to do a lot more work on, and we've said that in the consultation paper. We need to look at that 23%, and also look at what would be the mitigations, what's the profile. We would be fairly certain it probably is a lot of those low wages. Where we tried to balance it is that back to that Joseph Rowntree work, and back to that £90 saying for a 3-bedroom house for a small average sized family, even on a relatively low income, that is a reasonable rent. All the more so if you can make improvements on outgoings, like in heating, like in fuel bills. So we're sort of saying as well, the rent has to reflect the standard of property that you're getting.
And I imagine you'll be consulting with the likes of the advice agencies, because obviously those sort of people you're talking about, Jim, they go to advice agencies.
And that's why for us, it's very critical for us that the consultation is a lengthy consultation, and it is as wide a consultation as we can get.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
And Jim?
Yeah, just carrying on a little bit on a theme that Sammy was touching on. When you push up the rents, you push up the housing benefit drawdown, which increases the housing benefit subsidy coming to Northern Ireland, which comes not through the block grant or not out of the block grant, comes at no cost to us. Isn't that right?
For those tenants whose rents would be made.
Yes. But looked at overall by the department, there must be therefore a resulting temptation to play the housing benefit game to maximise the subsidy.
No, I mean, well, yes, there could be, that might be assumed, but you'll see the figures we come up with are nothing to do with housing benefit. They were to do with rent levels.
But the only people, if you play that game, suffering the pain are the 22% who actually pay their own rent.
Well, they're suffering. I mean, yes, you're right. We're clear that group who pays their own rent obviously have to pay increased rent. So the balancing act for us was, well, how much of an impact will it be on them, and what should be the...
They're the only people experiencing pain. So the temptation is push rents up, as in the majority of cases, that means more money into the department through the housing benefit subsidy, and maybe there's a temptation to think, well, the 22% who are paying, they can afford to pay a bit more.
It's partly, if I can just say, it's partly our rationale for looking at what's done in other jurisdictions as well, because England did this policy 10 years ago and has been bringing these rents to this level, so it gives us a bit of ground to say what we're doing isn't anything above what has been done elsewhere. It's not excessive compared to what's been done elsewhere.
I'm just trying to drill into how far the department has fallen for that temptation in order to maximise its own intake of subsidy funding.
Well, I suppose there's 3 points I would make. The first is that there's a similar percentage of people who pay their own rent within the housing association sector. So there are 23% of social housing tenants in the social housing, in the housing association sector who are currently paying that £90, because we said that's the average rate. So within Northern Ireland, there are people of a similar, because the makeup of the profile of tenants in social housing tenants is the same whether it's a housing association tenant or a housing executive tenant. The second important thing is rents we've tried to make a strong connection, and it's an important connection. Rents should reflect the nature of the property. So low rents, whether you pay them yourself or whether they're paid by housing benefit, impact on the level of maintenance and service that your property can get. So therefore, a tenant who is paying 23% of pay may well, or would certainly expect and anticipate that if there was a rent increase, they should notice that in improvements in their property, either through more plant maintenance, more effective maintenance, because that's what it's for, that's what the rent's used for. And I suppose the third element of it is that in terms of housing benefit and maximising drawdown, it's almost looking at the other way, which is if this was the case, we'd simply be moving housing benefit drawdown to where it is common across the rest of the UK, and that money is used, whether it's housing benefit or rent, that is used for construction jobs, for maintenance, for improving people's homes.
Yeah, just so it's clear, the housing benefit subsidy comes to the department and stays in the department?
No.
Where does it go?
It goes to the landlord.
No, oh, yes, of course. But where the landlord is the housing executive.
So it goes to the housing executive.
Yes, it stays within the department in that sense.
Well, yes, it does. Although the landlord function of the housing executive maintains all its income as a landlord. So all the rental it gets, it's as a landlord. It can't cross-subsidise non-landlord activities. So its regional activities aren't cross-subsidised by its landlord activities. So the housing executive, as its public corporation body, retains all its rent for its landlord function. So it's.
But that includes its component of the housing benefit subsidy.
Yes, it's rent. That rent, that's housing benefit. It's the same as in that way, the housing benefit is the individual's support rather than the organisation. That just is a method of getting them up. It's how the individual makes their rent payment, and it's the rent that the landlord retains. It doesn't come anywhere else into the department or cross-subsidised.
Thank you.
Roy.
Again, thanks for your presentation. Like Jim, I agree that the focus has to be on those that potentially would be working and raising their own income and having to suffer additional increases, the working poor. Have you looked at any other proposed changes in the benefit system to see how that would impact in this group? Because you could be doing your analysis on it based on current situations as opposed to what might be proposed coming in down the line.
It's very difficult to anticipate future changes and what they may.
Well, what has been proposed?
Yeah, well, we've done a few, and it's a difficult one. It's easier to do some of that analysis for people who are currently receiving benefits and housing benefits. It's easier to understand what the changes might mean. It's much more difficult to assess an impact on an individual who's currently not receiving the benefit for rent. So what we have done is modelled, and we mentioned it, and there are a number of case studies which we need to tidy up as well. They're very complex, but what we have modelled is if someone's wage was X, they'd currently now be liable to pay rent. If rent moved to Y and their wage didn't, would they start to be eligible for housing benefit? So we've done that modelling. So we know that a number of people would be drawn in. So we can't tell you who, but what we can tell you is what income level they would have that would draw them into benefit. And then we can also say that if they didn't have that income level, or they had a higher income level, we then can say, but if the rent was this, it would still appear to be affordable. So that's the two calculations we've done. We've done a calculation of if this is your income and this is your rent. If your rent went to this and your income didn't change, would you get benefit? Yes. And the third one we've done is if your income was this and you weren't getting benefit and your rent was Y, does that look affordable as a percentage using Joseph Rowntree as a benchmark? So
you've produced a very extensive document, lots and lots of information, but can you maybe just point me to the quite an important bit of detail, which would be
30.
But important bit of detail in terms of your current income from rental and how that compares with your current expenditure on the properties, whether in terms of maintenance and improvement.
Sorry, the current income level versus...
The current rental, your income that you're getting from all your tenants and the current expenditure in terms of maintenance and improvement.
We haven't got, it's not in this document because it wasn't...
That's quite a key bit of information?
The housing executive roughly spends around 150 to 160 million per annum on maintenance. And obviously all of that is fully funded from the rental income, more or less. There's a modest capital budget. Rental income, I haven't got total
Housing
income.
benefits about 231 million.
Yeah.
231 million on housing benefit.
Balance is servicing management costs and historic debt.
My memory just going back to your previous presenters who had indicated that was it 17 million and 25 million was being spent on...
That was response maintenance.
Response maintenance. That's just pure response maintenance.
So
as opposed to other
160 is
improvements.
response and planned. Plan's usually bigger, that's kitchens, bathrooms.
Okay, okay. So in terms of that then, any further capital investment, is there any further capital investment coming from the private sector towards housing executive or social housing other than the new build grant scheme?
The private sector funding is only drawn into the housing association sector because they can access it. There's no private financing in the housing executive stock. It's either rental income or if government has any capital funds. Now there's been very limited capital budgets available, or if it has a house sale, it can invest. So that's the housing executive source of income. Now we mentioned that significant investment requirement over a number of years. Really, the key for us is the gap between the rental income and how much you're spending on investment versus emerging figures of what maybe should be spent on investment to make the properties thermal efficient up to very modern standards.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Tell me, did he, as a result of this, have discussed any contingency plans that as a result of that, I'd say that people that would be paying the rent, if people fell into arrears, how you would deal with them?
Well, in terms of arrears, obviously that does fall to the landlord. We've done some. We've looked a bit at our arrears because we wanted to get a feel for is this going to drive up massively arrears. And again, we can only point to the fact that the social housing tenant base is similar whether you're in a housing association or in the housing executive. So 23% pay in both scenarios. People in the housing association houses are paying slightly higher rents. That may well be offset by lower, for example, fuel outgoings. But the level of arrears, and most people who are in arrears are either partial housing benefit or full paying. Between the housing executive, with low rents, is about 4.3%. Housing associations with high rents, it's about 5%. Very little difference. So both sectors have about roughly the same level of arrears. So that would imply to us this rental policy, which pushes the same, all things being equal, shouldn't necessarily engender a huge number of arrears, especially if people on low income start to fall in to the housing benefit support arrangements.
Just picking up on some other stuff that's coming out of England, especially from the introduction of bedroom tax. There are a huge amount of people, a huge amount of money that's been paid for people again getting into hostel or hotel accommodation, but also the huge amount of people that have fell directly into arrears as a result of it, and the impact that is having on families. And and any dramatic increase, even over a period of time, on rent increases that could have an impact. It goes back to it's pay your rent or feed your children scenario also, and I think that's a difficulty. I actually wanted to touch on it at the start. It's in around the Savile inquiry to look at the house conditions and but you mentioned 209. I also thought that in 2009 Savile's had criticised the housing executive because they said they were maintaining their houses, and that had suggested that they scale back on the level of investment regarding cyclical maintenance and things like that there, and that has had an impact on the fabric of the housing.
Yeah. I think there was a lot of recommendations in that 2009 report. One looked at the future quantum of investment that was going to be required and how you should service it. Another part of it was making recommendations as what's the best way about doing investment. So I know, sometimes they might seem like two counter arguments, but it wasn't. One was saying you need to do an awful lot of investment, and the second was saying, well, what's the best way to do an investment? And it queried whether the best way to do it was, I think, how the nature and approach to multi-element improvement. Do you do it exactly the way you're doing it at the moment, or is it better to do it on a more cyclical basis?
But I think it was changed as a result of that.
Well, I think it was two things probably changed it. One was Savile's in part, and the current one will do the same. sort of put the house and say, look at your investment and how you're supposed to do your investment. And the third was that date also coincided with when they stopped getting an awful lot of capital receipts in from house sales. So their actual approach had to be looked at by Savills, and their capability, because of the money available, also dramatically changed.
Thanks for that. The last thing is that how you handle the consultation. And have you taken into consideration that I know you're talking about 16 weeks, the impact that the summer holidays will have on it. And I think along with that, and I know that is it probably departed from the usual thing. You know that I get fairly cynical when we talk about consultations, but I thought the one that we just went through was much better than the ones before. And they tend to continue to go down that road. And how you actually expand it to encourage residents associations, individual tenants and things like that to participate in.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly know we'll take the tenant participation approach as a model, because rent is equally or more important to them. So we know that the bulk of the work will be in engaging with tenants groups. We have done some of that already without outlining the proposals, but just to outline the fact that this piece of work is going on. So we will keep doing that, and we will be meeting with as many residents and representatives as we can.
Okay, folks, any members have any other questions? I want to thank you again for a very extensive presentation, a lot of information and a lot of food for thought, so thanks very much. Item 8, correspondence. There's a letter from Dr. Malcolm McKibben at pages 263 of members' meeting packs in relation to the response regarding the recommendations made in the committee's Phase 3 inquiry report. Dr. McKibben has advised that the First Minister, Deputy First Minister, will provide DFM's formal response, and it is therefore inappropriate for him to respond separately.
Chair, could I say I think that's a very inappropriate response. I think it's a total cop-out. There's a very specific issue raised in the report about the management and control of civil servants who happen to be special advisors. And Dr. McKibben is the head of the civil service. He therefore has an oversight which he shouldn't be ducking and simply passing it off to the First and Deputy First Minister. It's a civil service issue that he needs to address, and that's what the recommendation, if I recall correctly, was seeking to focus on. So, to me, it's just another cop-out and running away from this issue.
Have you any suggestions, Chairman?
I think we should write back to him and make those points very forcefully to him. That we think that this is a civil service management issue in relation to a type of civil servant.
Okay, people have been content with that?
Yep, it's fine.
Okay, case 13 of the table items, the Assembly Executive and Review Committee has advised that it agreed in February 2015 that it would return to considerations relating to, amongst other things, the Ministerial Code after the publication of its report onto the operation of the provisions of Parts 3 and 4 of the NI Act 1998 May 2015. I think we're talking about the chair writing back to the Arts Committee.
Yes, Chair, it's just a case of, we've suggested that maybe the Chair writes back to thank him for the response and ask that AERC continues to update the committee on the scheduling of its consideration of that issue, so that the committee is aware of what the AERC position ultimately is.
Has anybody any comments on it?
Other just to say I'm declaring interest as a member of the AERC committee.
I take it members have went through other pieces of correspondence and
Just a question I have is we were told that the ARC will take a look at it following the publication of the Assembly Executive Review Report in May 2015, which no doubt has already happened. So my question is, when will we hear from them? Is the matter being discussed or coming towards a conclusion?
Chair, the ARC actually agreed in February 2015 to return, and so they will return to the matter. And the suggestion is that the proposal is that the committee, this committee would then continue to liaise with the ARC when they've reconsidered the issue.
Well, perhaps we might ask for a time, you know, I mean, the time frame's
frame.
already gone, so we'd ask, was it discussed, and if so, what was the outcome? If not, when will it be?
To the degree why that I certainly would see that it justified to take a degree of urgency. This issue is already several years old. And it was a very historical investigation. The weakness has been there for some time, and you wouldn't want to have to wait for several more years before a solution comes into being.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are members content that other parts of correspondence are actioned as outlined on the correspondence memo, page of page 233?
Right.
The forward work programme. Are people content with the forward work programme was drafted?
Great, very good.
Let's see, any of our business talkback has been in touch with the committee, and they're looking for a committee member to speak on an issue relating to the removal of a rainbow flag from a housing association property by housing association officials. So they're looking for somebody from the committee to volunteer themselves for the talkback. Well, I'll leave it at that.
Chair, after the committee meeting, maybe if a member is interested in speaking to talkback, they can let us know, and we'll put in contact with the communications office.
Would the acting chair take care of that?
Is there anybody on our business? Sammy?
Two things. I know the chair hasn't been here this last couple of weeks. I'm just wondering, I know he'd been ill last year. Has he been ill or whatever?
He's been in the hospital and he's been getting injections for pain relief, and they're fairly severe. So he's been out of operation, but hopefully he'll be back next week. So if people want, if we could send a letter off to him, just
Yes.
Did the accident come?
Yeah, absolutely.
And Chair, as you know, I'm only on the committee a few weeks, back on again.
Some of you are never only on a committee, you know. You always keep
I've been
your
watching from afar. I was just going to check out, could maybe somebody give us an update about the whole licensing laws? I've lost track of that. What was that?
I think that's penciled in, isn't it?
Yes, in the business plan for the department in 2015, licensing regulation was one of the pieces of legislation that was to come forward. However, if you look at the provisional order paper for the next couple of weeks, it doesn't appear. But if members were content, we could write to the department and ask if there was the case that is likely that might be brought forward in the autumn.
I think, sure, that's an important point, because I know I'm sure I, like others, have been lobbied on the matter, and it does link across to the wider potential for tourism, I think, as well, and for helping some businesses to survive. So.
Chair, maybe I wanted to clarify this. My son runs a pub, and he wasn't going to ask me, but a couple of people have said in the last couple of weeks. Okay. I hardly see him.
So any other items under any other business? If not, we declare the meeting adjourned. And the meeting will take place next Thursday, 25th of June, 2015, room 20, Parliament.
Very much.
29.